Martin North, John Adams, in the interest of the people. Hello, John.
Hello.
Well, what can we say? $1 trillion plus.
It is perhaps, a very sad day. We were just talking before off camera. I mean, I really was, so this to me is not a normal budget. It is the biggest economic catastrophe or financial catastrophe in the history of the country. What we saw last night with the budget is, it will have long-term consequences, and we're going to get into some of the reasons why. And, I know I have children and a 6-year-old and a 1.5-year-old, and I'm thinking about their long-term future. Basically, their future was basically written off last night by the government. And there is no way we can recover from the financial hole that was dug in the budget.
Right. So basically that big number, 1 trillion plus, it will be a lot more than that probably in the end, is in your view unsustainable, crazy, and essentially isn't going to solve a lot anyway.
No. The thing is, like when we first... So I wrote an essay in April. We did a 2-part series back in April about how the coalition destroyed the economy within 4 weeks. I said that COVID-19 was not the risk that they said it was initially. And it's interesting. So we've gone a bit back and forth on this. And now only in the last few days that the World Health Organization has now come up with an estimate saying that up to 10% of the global population, or 780 million people, may have already been infected with COVID. Now, how could that have happened? Well, the theory by Professor Steele that it's an airborne virus. I mean that could be an explanation. Now, I haven't gone into the detail, but the media has been saying for 6 months, stick with the WHO. Well, the WHO has been against lockdowns. Clearly, I mean, this is on the record. And now they're saying that up to 780 million people may have already been infected. Well, if that's the case, assuming you accept the death count, and I have some serious questions about the death count, but assuming it is 1 million people, 1 million out of 780 million, yes, it's slightly higher than the flu, but it's not the Spanish flu, it's not the Black Plague from Europe. So the question is, so I've said all along, lockdown is not justified. The stimulus is not justified. Now, what we saw last night was that the coalition revealed the budget for last financial year. So the budget deficit, which was at $85 billion. And then obviously they revealed the budget deficit for this financial year, 2021, and the years forward. And if you from this financial year, in the 3 financial years forward from this financial year, they've added 480 billion in terms of deficits. So 480 plus 85, almost $600 billion in a reaction to a virus, which now the WHO is saying it's not as big as what we thought initially. And who was driving the hysteria? Imperial College, Neil Ferguson, 40 million deaths worldwide if we did nothing. Complete fantasy modelling. Never was going to happen.
And it's difficult, John, because I personally have lost 2 of my friends, in other parts of the world, directly from the virus, right? And that's the point, that whilst you can talk in generalities, it is a real killer. Right?
Oh, sure. So I never said it's not the virus doesn't exist. The virus is real. It does kill people. But when you were sitting down for public policy, there is a ultimate cost benefit analysis that has to be done. I mean, during war times. I mean, I know of stories of Winston Churchill willing to sacrifice British soldiers or Allied forces in order to gain a strategic advantage in terms of the war against Germany. So even wartime leaders have said, if I have to lose 5,000 troops, 10,000 troops in order so that we can actually break through and actually, beat the enemy, we're willing to make those sort of sacrifices. So the question always is a question of proportion. What is the risk? How bad is it going to be? And what is the cost of trying to mitigate that risk? And is the cost worse than the mitigation? And in my view, the cost has definitely been worse than the lockdown. Even though, again, the WHO has said don't do lockdowns. Now, I've never said don't do anything. I mean, there are mitigation strategies that you can do that without locking down, but what we've done to the economy has been horrendous. What we've done to civil rights and political freedom in this country has set precedents that that in centuries ago in England would have led to civil war, and here we are, racking up $600 billion of debt. And when you look at the projections going out to 2030, and we'll get into this in a second, we're talking about levels of debt that this country has never been in before, in a nominal sense. Now, some people say that on a GDP basis, it's not as bad as World War II, but we fought for our lives against the Japanese then. What do we fight? We're not fighting an external enemy that will justify this sort of expense. But the other thing is about post-World War II, we were able to grow the population because we were still a young population, and we were still we were able to generate a lot of economic growth because we were able to expand. Well, we've got a big population now. The capacity to absorb millions of more people is questionable, and we are digging up our resources and selling it to the world. Well, with all the natural wealth that we have now, are we actually going to sell it and actually do something with it? Or do we just have to sell it to retire debt? So from our own natural wealth, we get no net benefit going forward because we've been so irresponsible and we've panicked about this COVID-19.
Right. In fact, the next 2 years, they're forecasting negative migration. In other words, population drop rather than growth, which is another very profound impact in terms of the numbers ahead.
Yep.
Now, one question I had for you, John, was they postponed the budget from earlier in the year to October, right? Mm-hmm. Is that significant in its own right, do you think?
Yes. So one of the reasons why the budget is handed down in May is usually if you're announcing measures for the next financial year, you give people some certainty and you don't have to bring in retrospective laws. Now, part of the tax cuts last night, the income tax cuts, that was going to, they've backdated that to the 1st of July. So there is some retrospective aspects that are bringing forward to it. But obviously, one would have hoped for more transparency. Now, they would have said it was a very uncertain environment. We put in a whole bunch of immediate measures to deal with what we were thinking, and we needed time to see how things played out and obviously to come up with a more comprehensive document. So, I don't think, I'm not particularly fussed about an October budget per se. Okay. In terms of the timing, I'm more interested in the detail and the outcome.
Yeah, okay. Well, let's go into some of that, right? Because it's worth, I think, maybe we won't go into each individual policy area because that will take way too long. But there are some very important overall points to make, aren't there?
Indeed. So you talked about. So a lot of people do talk about it in terms of $1 trillion over the next 4 years. Now, one of the things that the budget does talk about in some detail is about 2030 and try to give you a decade-long forecast. Yes. Now, let's put this on the screen. Now, they didn't actually give hard numbers, but I did a bit of simple math. So they said that gross government debt by 2030 would be about 55.1% of GDP. And net debt would be 39.6% of GDP. Now, the estimate around GDP, they had a bit of a table, and you could see you were talking roughly about 3.3 trillion of GDP, whereas we're now about 1.7. So when you use these sort of proportions, we're talking gross government debt at 1.8 trillion and net government debt at 1.3 trillion. And the news.com.au, they wrote an article today based on analysis from the Institute of Public Affairs, so let's put that on the screen. And the assumption of the IPA is once we get to a surplus, if we maintain that surplus at 1% of GDP, we will pay off gross government debt by 2080. So that is. You're going to be well gone by then. Yep. And I won't be around by then. And, to be honest, I'm not even sure if my children will be around by then to actually pay this off. So we're talking about 2 generations that have been bankrupted in terms of this process. And one of the big concerns that I have looking at the budget now, and one of the things I was hoping to see when I opened up the budget papers last night is, well, where's the roadmap? Where's the roadmap back to surplus? So you can say, okay, we needed to take a hit because of short-term circumstances, but let me give you a specific concrete plan of how do we dig our way out of this. And that budget last night did not do that in any sense, in any stretch of the imagination. And even though we're talking about astronomical numbers now, which are just crazy, these numbers are based on a set of assumptions about what's going to be happening over the next 2-3 years. And in my view, I looked at some of these assumptions and I was tweeting about on social media. People couldn't believe some of these assumptions. And I'm scratching my head thinking, well, are these conservative assumptions? Are these aggressive assumptions? I mean, I thought some of these assumptions were very rubbery to my mind. What was your reaction to the assumptions that you sort of were looking through?
Well, I saw a few pigs flying by, right? I mean, the fact is they have used different scenarios, and that's probably appropriate. I use scenarios, as you know. But some of their basic assumptions seem to me to be heroic at best, right? And hardly grounded in anything other than just maybe hope.
Yes. So given that you and I question the assumptions, so we're effectively saying that we think that potentially the deficit could be bigger than what they have published, which means that when you get into the 2030 projections, gross government debt could be more than $2 trillion.
Right. And the point there is, John, that the things that they're proposing to spend money on, I'm not necessarily convinced that will be the right way to spend that money in any case, right? So there's a couple of different things going on here. One is, how much should they spend? Secondly, where should they spend it, right? And the third is, I guess, what you're going to do about it. Now, they fail, in my mind, on all of those three things.
So why don't we spend how about we spend a second just about the composition of the budget?
Sure.
So there was some broad strokes about. So obviously what they're trying to do is to minimize unemployment because, and again, we'll get into this at the end of the show. But why do they want to minimize unemployment? It's because of the household debt bubble. It's because of the banks. It's because of the mortgages. So they need to keep people on a cash flow basis solvent, so that the banks don't get in trouble, because that's who ultimately this is all about in terms of the banks. So there was a whole host of stimulus to spur private sector growth in particular. And we've got, in this financial year, a lot of public sector support. And when we get into 21, 22, the public sector support sort of draws back quite a bit on the assumption that the private sector is going to pick up with the economy fully opening up. But there was a lot of tax cuts, particularly personal income tax cuts, and they're backdated to 1 July. There was an increase in infrastructure spending. So I think they've committed $110 billion over 10 years. There was a range of incentives in terms of business, in terms of tax incentives, write-offs, etc. around that. And then there's a whole bunch of other strategies that they've announced to help spur the private sector to come back, including reducing regulatory burden. Now, I worked on the government's deregulation agenda back in 2012-13 as the key advisor. They've been talking about this for a long time. I'm not sure that they've actually achieved much in almost a decade. So they're looking at insolvency reform. And obviously we've talked about this in a previous show about technically you're still allowed to trade insolvent up until, is it the end of the year? So, but they obviously want to reform the model so some of these businesses can continue to see if they can trade out of their current position rather than actually having to fold up. We had JobKeeper and JobSeeker, which we'll be going through to March. Now they've come up with JobMaker, which is effectively a wage subsidy scheme, like what they call hiring credits for 16 to 35-year-olds, and they're hoping to create 450,000 positions for that cohort of people. And obviously, you think about these people, a lot of first home buyers. So obviously, there's a linkage to the property market because they need more demand to keep these property prices up. You had positions for 100,000 new apprentices. You have a modern manufacturing strategy of $1.3 billion. Bringing forward some defence spending, recurring school funding at $309 billion up until 2030, and all of this is on the assumption that they can cap. Now, in a previous show, we said this is based on RBA forecast that unemployment was going to go to 10% by Christmas. Now, they said that they think they can cap unemployment at 8%, and hopefully by June 2022. So we're talking about almost 2 years from now, or just under 2 years. They hope that they can bring unemployment down to 6.5%. Now it's interesting that with JobMaker and some of these other strategies, they said these will remain in place until unemployment is well below 6%. So we're talking, so if we're 2020 now, we're talking 2023, 2024, where some of these measures will be wound back if you can get unemployment below. But I think one of the questions you've asked, and it's a very valid question to ask, is, well, where are the jobs coming from? Because we had a strategy of flooding the country through with immigrants and just building houses and keeping occupied with that, plus some mining, plus some education. Well, well, look. So you just said earlier in the show that net migration is falling. Look, over the next 1-2 years.
Yep.
So the model that was from GFC to 2020, that model was not likely to work going forward because of these restrictions. So what is the economic model that's going to generate these jobs that are going to basically get unemployment capped at 8% down to 6.5%?
Well, my fundamental issue is that they've basically just assumed that the economy will revert back to where it was, right? So there's this blip and we're investing to support it, but there's nothing fundamentally changed in the way they're thinking about the economy. And I think that's a major mistake.
Yeah, totally. So they're sort of hoping and praying, and you know, one of the things that I saw announced in the budget was, so I think at the beginning of the year when COVID first started, it was announced last year that they were going to have 10,000 places for new home buyers who would only have to put down a 5% deposit. So that those 10,000 places have been taken up, so that they've announced another new 10,000 places,
Yep.
So 20,000 places in total, and they're obviously luring people into the property market, hoping that they can keep demand up, because you know, one of the reasons why we haven't seen property start to fall aggressively is because the listings are down, and I know that's something that you've talked about at length, and the expectation is that at some point the listings will increase. So, well, when the listings increase, you need buyers. So obviously, providing them with JobMaker, providing them with new incentives to buy, hopefully starts to again bring in extra demand into the market to meet that additional listing supply that we think is going to happen at some point in the market.
Yeah, and let me just talk about JobMaker for a second, John, because I'm quite concerned about this, right? If you think about JobKeeper was effectively paying money to businesses, right, to allow them to continue to pay salaries to people, right? Now, we know a lot of big businesses actually reported very significant profit increases because they used JobKeeper to do that, right? Now, the thing with JobMaker is what's to stop them doing the same again? And the money's coming into the business, right? I suspect that we're going to see precisely the same behaviour there. And it may well be that the very businesses who could and should be hiring, the small end of town, will end up not. And it will all go to the big end of town again, those large organisations. I think this is a very concerning strategy of basically putting all of the funding into business and then basically getting business to pass it through. I'm very concerned that is not going to be well executed or policed. And we know last time around with JobKeeper, accountants worked long and hard to make sure that those businesses maximise the benefits of those schemes, right? We're going to see the same again.
Yes. And you know, one of the big tests of JobMaker, but also the extension of Keeper and Seeker is, so if in the recent Four Corners episode where Stephen Long talked about the COVID recession, you had a couple of insolvency practitioners give a forecast as to, well, how many businesses are actually going to go belly up. And we're talking from maybe 100,000 businesses to one person said potentially up to 500,000 businesses, which would be depression level sort of activity. So this is all about, so even if it's big town support, it's little town support, the name of the game is to keep these businesses still commercially active. And the question is, well, you know, I mean, maybe in the next few months it'd be worthwhile to maybe find a insolvency practitioner to sort of come and talk about their forecast of what this all means for in terms of the number of insolvencies going forward. Because what Keeper and Seeker has guaranteed is that bankruptcies and insolvencies over the last 6 months has fallen through the floor in terms of volume, and so they're all waiting to, you know, waiting for this big uplift and businesses are being wound up. The question is, how many are there going to be, and what's the flow on impact to unemployment? So obviously, with unemployment capping at 8%, according to the budget papers, they don't think it's going to be that significant.
Well, we'll see. I mean, the zombie businesses certainly are there. I'm seeing them in my surveys already. And there are still people saying it's going to be very hard to continue trading through this, even with some of these things that are now being spoken about. And I've seen a couple of people respond to me directly saying, well, these capital write-offs that they can do is fine if they're going to spend money. They don't have the money to spend in the first place, so they can't take advantage of it, right? And with the idea of job maker, which is to basically employ young people, if there's not sufficient activity in the business, they can't do it anyway.
Yeah.
So, this is not necessarily going to lead, I suspect, to where people hope it will.
Now, look, moving on. So why don't we just spend a couple of moments about talking about the assumptions? Now, one of the most concerning assumptions that I think, look, and again, I didn't watch any of the coverage. I read some of the articles, but I was really studying the budget papers directly. One of the key assumptions that they made was they provided two scenarios in the budget papers. One is that there's effectively a vaccine rollout by 1 July 2021, or that we're going to have continued lockdowns up until June of 2022. So again, now on the vaccine, I've been on the record. I'm not taking the vaccine, come hell or high water. And I think you've said that you've got concerns about the safety, the efficacy of the vaccine. And there's a question of, well, how effective is the vaccine? How many people are willing to take the vaccine? To what extent has public trust eroded with big pharma who are going to come up with these vaccines? So the vaccine strategy, again, is questionable because obviously, the president of the United States has COVID. He has a treatment which is not a vaccine. And the question is, well, are the new treatments effective that perhaps may warrant in terms of a vaccine redundant. But the other thing is that by looking at, say, our interview with Professor Steele, he basically said by the time you have an effective vaccine, in his professional scientific assessment, COVID-19 would not be as big of an issue as it was initially. And the question is, well, to what extent is a vaccine needed at the point that it's rolled out? So there's some questions there. But, we were told on the lockdown that this was effectively a short-term strategy to not eliminate the virus. This was all about flattening the curve. So why are we talking in the budget papers of continued lockdowns for another 18 months? The politicians need to basically confess to the people what the hell, what is the real strategy on COVID? Is it elimination? Is it suppression? Is it flattening the curve? Because some European countries have case counts in the hundreds per day, but they are learning to live with the virus as opposed to destroying themselves economically to see if they can eliminate it.
Well, I guess it's wise to think about a better and a worse case scenario. What I'm not clear about is where they ended up. So they seem to have assumed that effectively there will be a vaccine, it will be widely rolled out, and therefore the borders will be opening. And a lot of this actually is predicated on international borders opening. Right? But that means, think about it, John, it means that it has to be available not just in Australia, but it has to be also clear elsewhere.
Yes.
That's a really big assumption, right? So this has to be a global deployment, not just an Australian deployment.
Yes, although on the Australian deployment, one of the things and I've got contacts in WA. McGowan has said nothing about when he'll unlock the border. He's given some very broad benchmarks.
Maybe March or something, but he's not clear.
Well, but the budget papers say that the border's going to open up in April.
Yeah,
that's the budget assumption. Now, why is April significant? Lo and behold, that's just after the WA state election.
Yes.
So the question now becomes is, well, why would you unlock after an election? Is this political or is this science?
Yeah. Well, there's always a lot of science and a lot of politics all wrapped up together, right? And you never quite know which side of the coin you're looking at.
So when I look at these, if you're basing a budget on these scenarios, I think these assumptions, these scenarios are very questionable as to whether these are the right scenarios to frame a budget on. But then when you look at when we get into some of the other assumptions, so when you look at the Australian economy, they're projecting a turnaround in GDP of 6.25%
Yep.
from negative 1.5 for this financial year to 4 and 4.75, so 4.75% for next financial year. And we're not talking about nominal GDP; we're talking about real GDP once you take into account inflation. And then obviously this massive turnaround in the economy from this financial year to next is predicated on a 10% turnaround in private sector demand from negative 3.5. So the private sector is supposed to contract 3.5% this financial year, and it's supposed to grow about 6.5% in the subsequent year.
Yep.
So this again is all the stimulus, all these strategies is going to generate the jobs that's going to lift the private sector. So I don't even think I'd be surprised if these assumptions even have a full understanding about zombie companies and companies that look to exist, but they're actually not actually being productive or employing or actually producing real goods and services.
Right, and the critical point about that is, remember, half of the GDP tends to come from consumers spending, right? So my question is, what is it that's going to turn consumers around? I mean, the confidence levels are still quite low at the moment, right? And we know that incomes are going to be very, very flat for a long period of time. So I don't understand where that uplift is going to come from.
Yes, because and one of the key points on that is there's a big difference between getting a tax cut versus getting a payment.
Yes.
Because if you're expecting an uplift in consumption because you're cutting taxes, well, people have to generate income first before they can actually spend. And again, so I think there are some big questions around this. Now, when you've looked at, say, particularly when Swan was the treasurer and even Joe Hockey, there's been some big issues with forecasting tax revenue in the federal budget because they have very dodgy assumptions around wages growth. So the wages growth, I didn't see it to be too extreme in last night's budget. But when it comes to where they think the economy is going forward, Treasury has been horrendous in the last decade. So I've got some big questions about this big turnaround from this financial year to next for Australia. But then the bigger thing to my mind is the economic growth assumptions for the world.
Yes.
So they're assuming a V-shaped recovery for the global economy. And so you look at India, they're assuming an 18 points turnaround from negative 9% in 2020 to positive 9%. You've got Europe going 12.5% from negative 9 to positive 3.5. Japan, an 8.25% swing from negative 5 3/4 to positive 2.5. United States from negative 5.5 to 2.2. I mean, these are big turnarounds. Now, it should say that not all the countries around the world have implemented lockdowns to their extent. So you could say, because we had an extreme lockdown, if you unlock, if you allow businesses to operate legally, that's going to bring back some activity. Now, some of these other countries didn't lock down to the extent that we did, because Victoria is one of the harshest in the world. And obviously, you got New Zealand even more draconian than Victoria. So the question is, well, they can't rely that if you unlock, you're going to have this big turnaround. So the budget papers were completely silent as to what is the catalyst for some of these economies to have these big dramatic turnarounds. And, maybe park India to one side, but when you look at, say, Europe or Japan or even the United States, they have big structural problems in their economy, which are going to dampen future prosperity, future growth going forward. And again, I've had a long issue in the federal budgets for the last decade about these international growth statistics, and they never provided a justification or an explanation as to, well, why are they going to see these big turnarounds.
And you should add China, right, which is 8%. Huge increase. Yes.
So China, they're saying that the 2020 is going to be growing at 1.75%, and then next year is going to grow at 8%. So you got a 6.25% turnaround.
Yep.
So again, now Wuhan did lock down, but to some understanding, they have tried to open up the economy already. So Wuhan had been having these big water parties with no social distancing, etc. So I'm not sure how much more unlocking of the Chinese economy could we expect in 2021 to see a massive reversal in this in sort of GDP.
Interesting, John. The trade balance that came out a couple of days ago was lower than people expected. In other words, our imports rose, but our exports dropped.
Yes.
Right, which is a worrying indicator, because previously we were actually seeing our exports booming.
Yes.
So another reason why maybe the GDP estimates are rather heroic.
Indeed. So yes. So is it fair to say that you've got some big questions as to whether these are grounded in realism or conservatism?
Well, I mean, 2 points. One is they're really bad at forecasting, period. They've been like that for a long, long time. So I always take them with a complete pinch of salt. But this time, frankly, there are so many variables and so many unknowns, and the international environment. Remember that the virus is still raging in some areas, actually accelerating, for example, in the UK at the moment. So there's all of those factors to bear in mind. But the other is, I'm not sure that people have thought through how this all translates back to real activity in our economy, right? Because essentially, we're still very narrowly based, aren't we? We've got the mining stuff and we've got construction.
Yes.
Particularly construction on houses.
And we did have universities, but
that's gone.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah. And we don't know when the borders will be open and when the students will come back. I'm sure they'll try and bring them back as soon as they can. But one of the educationalists I was talking to the other day said it's already too late, right? We've already lost 2 or 3 years of students because they basically sign up for a 3 or 4 year course, right?
Yes.
And therefore, those who haven't signed up this year and for next year means that over the next 2 or 3 years, we're going to have much lower numbers than previously.
So if we're talking about the Chinese student market, what they've committed to other countries that have taken them in during 2020.
Either that or they're actually...
Stay domestic.
Stay domestic, yeah. And that's part of what I think is going on in China. And of course, China is not being very positive with regard to Australia as a place to come and learn now.
Yes.
So that's something else to bear in mind.
Yeah. So now the other thing that is worth adding in is something that we said in our last show, which is that, and I've had some conversations with members of Parliament, is this is a very political Prime Minister. That we will have an election within 12 months. They want to win. And if we get into Christmas and the economy is worse than these projections, and you're starting to see political heat, because obviously we've seen Labor politicise JobKeeper, and they've said don't cut JobKeeper or Seeker. Now it's Wednesday today. We'll see Albanese's reply tomorrow. I dare say he's going to say that certain groups have been left out, and that there needs to be reversals on stimulus in some of these specific interest groups. I dare say that. So you look at the deficit, it's about, I think, $217 billion this financial year. The spending, so that's the deficit. The spending is more than $637 billion. If we get to Christmas and the economy is worse than what they projected, and it's looking to be having some political impact, I expect further announcements, whether it's reversal on Keeper or Seeker or whether it's more things. These, like I've been told point blank by a member of the coalition, they do not care about the medium term. They don't care about the long term. They just care about the next election. To hell with my children or the next 1-2 generations. I mean, I'm not making this up. This is the thinking within Parliament.
Short term.
And short term. And so, so this is Wednesday. Yesterday was the budget. Monday, I went to Canberra to speak to a coalition senator who wanted to sit down and talk about the RBA and gold and a couple of other issues. If you have a different idea about where to take the economy, there is no open reception at the Prime Minister's door. He doesn't want to listen to anything that's outside of his worldview. So you talk about Hitler in the bunker. I mean, quite frankly, I have politicians saying that they can't get the Prime Minister to listen to an alternative point of view, and that I think is one of the most dangerous things you have in politics, where you have fanatical ideologues who will not listen to evidence or alternative perspectives.
Well, and just jumping over there to Peter Tulips, the guy ex-RBA who basically through a freedom of information managed to get a point of view out essentially, which said that the Reserve Bank's a bit the same, right? They're fixated on a particular worldview, a particular set of strategies, and the RBA isn't interested in beyond that.
Yep.
So this is consistent not just within government, but more broadly among regulators and amongst the Reserve Bank. It is a structural issue in the way that Australia is governed at the moment.
Absolutely. So the question is, so we've touched on this, but I just want to really hone in on this point. What is this all about?
Yep.
Why have we
what's the real agenda?
What is the real agenda?
Correct.
Why have we bankrupted my kids and 2 generations, assuming we're ever going to pay this debt back? And I dare say that, and I want to do this in a subsequent show about, just to go through some options. What will it take to balance the budget and to actually pay down this debt?
Right.
Because once you get into some of the specifics, we're talking about a very different Australia if you have to start saying we're going to cut the welfare budget.
So just one point, John. There is a school of thought that says interest rates will be low for a generation or 2. Very, very low. So this debt is affordable. So we just keep rolling it over. We don't try and repay it, right? Now, if that is the strategy, which is just pushing it out into the never, never, right? Maybe there is a different conversation. Because basically, as long as rates are really low, that might be feasible. But there's a big risk if rates ever go up. And the other question is, surely debt ultimately has to be repaid at some point.
Well, that's how I was raised, and I think that's how you were raised. But I think that the world elites are not thinking like that. But the point about the global debt bubble is, as it grows, you need more and more stimulus to support it.
Yep.
So every time you have a hiccup, a recession, a downturn, we're talking about bigger numbers. So at some point, so the question that no one knows the answer to is how big can it go before it's too much? So at some point we will reach that limit as a globe. But I'm obviously very concerned about the global picture. But in terms of the domestic picture, the world we have really dug ourselves into a hole, such that the world could continue on for a little bit longer, and we could suffer all sorts of short-term effects. So there are countries today, so like Turkey or Lebanon or some of these other countries around the world, Argentina, Venezuela, who are really going through extraordinary hardship. Yet the global economy is still looking okay. So we don't have to automatically assume that we will go under if the world goes under. No, we can go under in and of ourselves, irrespective of what's happening around the world.
Right. And I want to come back to your point from earlier on, right? Remember, the whole point here is to keep housing debt going, right? Housing debt has to be kept going because it's supporting the banking system, financial stability. That means we need more people to come in and buy more houses to be able to actually support it. That means that we need more jobs so they can pay their mortgages to keep the housing bubble going.
So when I was in Canberra on Monday, I put that point to a coalition senator, and I said, this whole COVID-19 strategy is about, this is an indirect bailout of the banking system, because without this, the banks would go under, and the banks basically run Parliament, run the coalition. And this senator was adamant. He agreed with me. This whole strategy is to bail out the banks. So, and obviously, and correct me if I'm wrong, the proportion of the bank's portfolio in terms of residential mortgages, it's 60%, 65%?
It's above 60%. If you then add in the construction on the top, you get up towards 75%. So we've got big building societies. We don't have banks.
Yeah. So anyone who thinks that this is good that the government is doing this, they actually care about you. They actually care about the future of the country. They don't. Politicians know this. I've had multiple people tell me this is short-term politics. It's about protecting the big end of town, vested interests, and we're destroying our future because of these short-term considerations.
Yeah, and plausible deniability comes back on the radar again, doesn't it? The COVID has basically given them a perfect prescription.
Absolutely. Now, in a previous show, I didn't actually reveal the MP. Now, I am so angry with what's happened. I'm willing to say that in December of 2018, I sat down with Tim Wilson, who's the chairman of the House Economics Committee, and he said that the establishment, remember, this guy cross-examines the RBA twice a year.
Yep.
Tim Wilson tells me that they all know that this is a stuffed position, and they need a plausible deniability strategy so they can bail out the system without telling the public that they actually did that. Well, now, back then, no one was talking COVID, so people were thinking Deutsche or a big bank. We couldn't see this bank happen or go under, but it happened. Well, lo and behold, here is COVID-19 that has come about. We can have a debate as to how did it come about, but it's here, and they have hyped it up, and then basically launched the mother of all stimulus packages to basically attempt to bail out the system.
Yeah, you could always say it's quite convenient that it appeared, right? And they were looking for an excuse, and this was a perfect excuse.
Yeah.
So what does it mean then? So we've basically got so much debt, we're probably never going to recover from it.
No. The thing is, so Australians have no idea what it would take to actually balance the budget. So when you start to look at if we're spending 637 billion, and the deficits are 213 billion for this financial year, if you want to start to cut $200 billion out of the spending, we're talking big cuts to welfare. The welfare budget is 217 billion. That alone, about 237 billion. Health, federal health spending, 94 billion. Defense is 30 billion. You look at housing, recreation, housing programs, 7 billion. Cultural activities, 5 billion. We're talking about some of the most politically sensitive areas that people have a natural expectation this is what government's going to do. And if someone said one day we have to suspend the pension because we just can't afford it if we're ever going to balance the budget and pay off this debt, I mean, it would cause all sorts of political, let alone social mayhem. So I want to come back and do a show and say, well, if we were serious, kind of like what you do, cash flow with some of your consultations. Yep. Show us your income, show us your expenses, and let's start to find a way to cut it. So if we were going to do a rational cutting exercise, we have to make some huge cuts. And it's not just one-off cuts, because sometimes, for example, a household may have some bills and say, okay, I'm going to tighten the belt for 12 months, and we'll get through this difficult period, and then we can sort of, loosen it up and start to live again. No, given the scale of the debt, if you're going to have a severe austerity campaign, you have to sustain this for, if not half to a full decade, just to have a chance to pay off this debt. Right.
But that means, if we put it all together, what we're actually doing is saying that Australian children and grandchildren probably are going to be basically there, caught in the crossfire, because what is being done is supporting the banking system and the housing sector now.
Yeah,
that's actually the bottom line, isn't it?
True. So my children and the children of Australia have been sacrificed. They've been sacrificed at the altar of the banks, and the banks are going to basically survive. And so now, when we've said in the past, no stimulus, Control, Alt, Delete, we need to restructure. We need to get away from too big to fail banks. We need to change the way banks lend because it's too much on residential real estate, too much on asset speculation. We need to actually get credit going into the right path of the economy. We need huge changes, but there's so much vested interest that it's hard to actually get reform. The only way you get reform is by bringing the banks to their knees, by actually collapsing this debt bubble. So that's why I've always said austerity, depression, because not just about the economics, it's about the politics. Because politically, you bring the banks to a conversation that in this current environment you can't bring them to.
Well, they're being protected. They are a protected species. They have huge power, both directly and indirectly. And you can see how all of the moving parts are being positioned to make sure that the financial stability is maintained, the banking system is maintained at any cost.
At any cost.
And that's the bottom line.
Yeah, and what I think Australians haven't fully come to terms with is, well, what does at any cost mean? It means destroying your family, destroying your kids. I honestly believe that we will never recover from this, because I think that the scale of the challenge to recover is too much for Australian society to handle, and I think that the 6th of October 2020 will go down in Australian history as the biggest financial catastrophe since 1788.
John, I appreciate your time tonight. Very, very disturbing conversation, but I think it's one we had to have.
Absolutely.
Okay. Martin North, John Adams, in Interest of People. We'll see you next time.